Jerry, how's it going today?
Doing well, Billy. Great to be with you.
Well, thanks for coming on. I've been wanting to reach out to you for a while now because you are probably the most prolific, you're definitely one of, but I think you might be the most prolific Christian author around today. You've done, is it true, over 190 books? How many books have you written?
The second book in the Chosen series, which I just finished and transmitted to the publisher, will be my 200th exactly.
That is that is insane. 200 books. Wow. All right. So when you work out the math on that, that is numerous books every year. I want to go through because for those who don't know, and I'm sure people do, you are the author of the Left Behind series. You are the author of the Chosen books as well, and it's exciting to hear that there is a second one coming. I want to talk about the first Chosen book, but let's just start with the fact before we even get to all of that that I would imagine you're a really proud dad watching Dallas, your son, create the Chosen series. And this is just blown up. What has it been like for you to sort of watch that process of him creating it and just all the reaction to it?
Well, I had a lot to do with the beginning of his career. I financed his movies early on, when he got out of college and stuff like that. And yeah, it is true that my button budget is getting out of hand. It's interesting because, of course, because he's my son, I think everything he does is brilliant, but I'm not always right. And I think sometimes things are going to be successes that aren't. And as he often talks about, this project was really born of failure. His last movie before The Chosen just bombed at the box office, and it was a surprise and a disappointment to all of us. But in this case, because he created this and took off with it on his own, I feel like this time I'm pressing my nose up against the glass and saying, "Can I play too?" And fortunately, he saw the value of having me write novels to go along with the seasons, and it's just been a thrill. And I just I'm really enjoying watching the phenomenon of it. That's one of the dangers of visibility and success, is that sometimes the phenomenon can overtake the point of what you're doing. And I learned this. I think I got a good lesson from Dr. LaHaye. It's interesting. The phenomenon of Left Behind came around about the same. Dallas and I would be the same age when these phenomenons hit, our mid 40s at that time for Left Behind, and same with Dallas now. And it's important. Dr. LaHaye always said, "Let the phenomenon take care of itself. Let's stick with the knitting, stick with what we did to get here." And the point was to share the truth and to make sure people aren't left behind. And in Dallas's case, introduce people to Jesus and let him make them someone they're not. So it's been a fun ride, and it's just getting bigger. It's going to be amazing to watch this thing.
Well, and he had a first, hand seat to watching you and Left Behind and all of that. So it's pretty amazing. It's actually pretty stunning to me to have a father and a son who both have had that level of success. And obviously, both involve writing. One arena is books, the other is obviously films and an amazing TV series. But I want to ask you because you mentioned the whole thing, putting your nose against the glass and saying, "Hey, can I play too?" The first book in the Chosen series that came out earlier this year, it's The Chosen. I Have Called You by Name. What led up to that? Where did that idea spark of, hey, we should actually do a novelized version of the series?
Well, this often happens, with the successful movies and TV series. Somebody will novelize it. Um, One of the things that I wanted to do, and I don't even remember if it was my idea or his. It was probably mine, but he immediately saw the value of it, and I wanted to make sure that when I do recreate the scenes that you see on the screen, that they're exactly the way you see them. One of my pet peeves when I go to a movie and then I want to read the book is, I know they need to take a lot of liberty, and that's one of the things that a novelist can add to the picture is you get a lot of inner monologue and what the characters are thinking and feeling as on the screen, if that happens, you have to have another character that they bounce things off of. You don't do a lot of voiceover, that type of thing. So that's what I added. But when I get to those scenes that you do see on the screen, I don't want those to vary and have people say, wait a minute, that didn't happen that way, or he didn't say that. So I make sure that those, I get to watch each episode of the Chosen. In the case of that first book, I watched those first 8 episodes more than 20 times each. And I never got tired of one
Wow.
scene. Um, you'd think you'd get bored with it after a while, but I'm emotionally moved with every one of them. And you're right that both of these involve writing. I think as beautiful a job as Dallas has done in creating this and directing it, and he really does draw out the best in these incredible actors. It's the writing that makes it, and Dallas and his two writing partners have just done an amazing job. That makes my job a lot easier because the sequence is already there, the basic story is already there, and I just get to sort of massage that and play with it and add those things on the page that you can't do on the screen.
Well, and I know too for you, I mean, you said this is your 200th, but that's just insane to me. I've written 4 books and I'm exhausted. So I don't even know. It's incredible to me that you've done that. But what was your journey into that? Because I would imagine a lot of people who are watching this, they may just be interested in obviously the process. Maybe there are aspiring writers, and I know you've done a lot in your career to help other writers and to pay it forward. But what was your journey into writing? And like, how did you first know you wanted to be an author?
Well, that's an interesting question because a lot of people, when they hear about the number of books I've done, they assume that I was called to write. And the fact is, I wasn't. I started writing. I've actually been a professional writer, in other words, getting paid for what I write, since I was 14. I went to the local newspaper and I asked the sports editor, how are you fixed for sports writers? And he said, why? And I said, because I am one. I had been doing this at home, with pretend things. I would play dice baseball and then I'd write it up as if it was a story in the newspaper. And I was a big kid, and I don't think he realized that I was too young to even drive at that point. My mother was waiting for me in the parking lot of the newspaper office. He assigned me a couple of high school games to cover. And so my mother would drive me to the games, and I'd take my notes, and then she'd drive me to the newspaper office, and I'd peck out my story. And back in the olden days, this is back when rainbows were still black and white, So I was getting paid $1 per inch that survived the sports editor's edit. And so even at age 14, I was walking around with $10 here, $12 there for these stories that would appear in the newspaper. And I thought that was going to be my life. I wanted to be a sports writer. And by the time I was 19, I was sports editor of that paper. But while I was a teenager, I felt a call not to writing, but to full time Christian work. And it was a definite call. I remember
Wow.
feeling under conviction at a camp meeting where a speaker was saying that some people, not only should we all be full time Christians, but some people are called to make their living as in full time Christian ministry. I thought that meant that I would have to give up the writing and start studying for the mission field or pastorate or something like that. But the speaker's wife was a really wise counselor, and she walked me through this call that I got that night. And she said something really profound that has stuck with me. She said, don't be too quick to give up the writing because often God equips us before he calls us. And she said, maybe you're equipped. This is the
Mm.
vehicle that you'll use to fulfill that call. So for the last half century, yes, I've averaged 4 books a year. I've slowed down now. I'm kind of picky about what I do, and I'm enjoying that part of it. But it's changed my whole view of success too. Most authors, especially, they consider success best-selling books, great reviews, big royalty checks. Those things have come in my career, and I'm grateful for them. But they're icing on the cake because to me, success is obedience. I'm obeying the call, and that means writing these books. I don't have any say over how they sell or what kind of response they get. Um, Even if all of my books had just been mid-list or sold a few thousand copies, I would have succeeded because to me, success is obedience. And it takes all that pressure off of worrying about how they're going to sell and what the reviews are going to be and that type of thing. So I feel grateful that way. And I'm not trying to be falsely modest, but Dallas teases me that he thinks I've now written more books than I've ever read. But the fact is, I feel like um, I have really been, and I'm not, as I say, not trying to be falsely modest. I really believe that I've been only given one gift. I'm mono gifted. I don't sing or dance or preach. Writing is what I do. And so I feel obligated to exercise that gift. And that's the reason I do what I do.
You're also speaking right now about calling, and I think it's so important for people to understand. You're saying I don't want to be falsely modest. I don't take it that way at all. I take it as though you're understanding this is what your calling is, and this is important for everyone. And you do that and you follow it no matter what the results are going to be. And it may be, like you were saying, there are authors out there who sell 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 copies maybe of all their books. And, rather than getting frustrated by that, recognizing that if they were called to that, they're living that out and they're doing it, right? And that there's a purpose
Right.
to that because of that calling. I think that is a really important thing for anybody to remember, because we can get discouraged when we lose sense of that and we don't, remember that if you've been called, there's a reason for it. So I appreciate you sharing that. How did you end up, putting that book series together? How did Left Behind, what was the impetus for Left Behind?
Well, it really was Dr. LaHaye's idea. He was an expert in obviously theology, and he was a minister, a preacher, and he'd written a lot of nonfiction books about the rapture and the end times. It was sort of a special area for him. And but he said those nonfiction books did pretty well. But he said everywhere he looked, he was seeing people reading novels, and so he asked his agent, can we find somebody to write novels based on this? And I remember my agent called me and he asked me if I knew Dr. LaHaye, and I said I'd never met him, but I have published him. When I was editor of Moody Magazine and in some other periodicals, I would publish articles by Dr. LaHaye, and so I would be happy to meet him. And he said, well, Dr. LaHaye is a nonfiction best-selling writer who has a great fiction idea, and you're a novelist with no ideas. So let's get you guys together. And we kind of hit it off immediately because Dr. LaHaye was the age of my parents. He's been gone now 5 years. In fact, he died on Dallas's birthday 5 years ago. And but he was a special person, and he had this idea. He said he and his wife had been flying back from a prophecy conference where he'd just been preaching on the rapture, and he said he noticed the pilot come out of the cockpit and flirt with the senior flight attendant. And he noticed that the pilot had a wedding ring on and the flight attendant didn't. And he thought, what would happen if right now the rapture occurred and my wife Beverly and I and maybe a third of the people on the plane just disappeared right out of their clothes? Obviously, it would scare the others to death. And he said, but maybe this pilot at home has a believing wife who's been trying to tell him about the potential of the rapture. And here it happens. That's what he had. That was the germ of the idea. I love the premise. I'd been raised in the same tradition. I believed in the rapture and the end times and that type of thing. In fact, Dr. LaHaye and I had a lot in common. We were both led to Christ by our mothers. We were both raised in Michigan, both raised in that tradition of believing in that Jesus was going to come back in the end times. And so I wrote a first chapter, and our agent shopped it to publishers, and Tyndale was the most excited about it. And that's really how that got started. And it was a wonderful run. We did 16 of those books, 12 in the main series, and then 3 prequels and a final sequel. And that people find it hard to believe, but the first Left Behind book actually came out in August of 1995. So we're talking 26 years ago. And that series is still clicking. It sold over 63 million copies, and it's still clicking along. The series sells about 15,000 units a month, even to this day. It remains a phenomenon that I've never been able to get over what happened with that thing.
How did working on that book series change your faith? I mean, was there any, or maybe it didn't, but I would imagine looking at the end times in that unique way and in such an intensive way would have an impact on you in some way.
Yeah, it really did, and it made me feel this sense of urgency. And of course, what a lot of people wanted to know, they get caught up in the phenomenon of it, and they talk about, who is the Antichrist and when is this going to happen and that type of thing. And Dr. LaHaye was one. He wished the rapture would happen in his lifetime, and obviously it didn't. But um, I took a slightly different tack. I believe that all the prophecies that need to be fulfilled have been fulfilled, and that Jesus could come in any second. That we're supposed to watch and wait for the imminent return. But there's that kind of confusing term that was written more than 2,000 years ago. Him saying, we're supposed to watch for the imminent return. So what does imminent mean? And I realized that in God's economy of time, Scripture is clear that to God a day is as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is as a day. So if God waits in His mercy one more day, we have 1,000 more years. Now, he may not wait. And as I say, I think the time has come, it could be any time. So we need to be ready, but we also need to be prepared to keep making sure that people don't get left behind. And we may have time to do that. And so that should be our calling. Watch and wait, but do something about it too, and make sure people know that this is a possibility that they need to be ready for.
What has been the most rewarding thing? Because you mentioned obviously so many copies of the books are still selling. What has been the most rewarding part of that for you years later, still watching the impact of Left Behind?
Well, you can imagine to any writer when books sell in the millions that it's such a gratifying thing, and it makes you feel good. But can you imagine when and people write to even general market writers and say your book changed my life because something in it really moved them, and they mean they were emotionally moved and they loved it and they'll talk about it the rest of their life. But when they wrote to us and we kept track of anybody that wrote to us on paper or visited us at an autograph party or later emailed us, and I still get those, where they tell us they've actually come to faith through reading a Left Behind book. When somebody tells you that they've gone from death to life, from darkness to light, that trumps any royalty check, any sales figure, any review. I mean, nothing can compare with that. And we heard from more than 3,000 people who tell us, and we know that represents many, many more who just never have communicated to us. But to have that literally happen, I always felt like I wasn't much of a good personal witness. I mean, I try to share my faith, but I'm not one of these who feels like I have the gift of evangelism, at least orally. And I know other people are bold and they go out and they ask people, "Do you know Jesus?" And they have all these stories. I always really felt like a second class citizen that way because for me, like many others, it's a fearful thing, and you don't want to offend people. Then you feel guilty because you're saying, "Well, I'm being so unoffensive. I'm maybe not offending them right into hell." But I feel like I do have this call to full time Christian work, and that means evangelism. That means sharing your faith. And I'm so privileged to be able to do that in writing and then to see those kind of results that nothing can compare with that.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because you could feel, convicted about not doing it orally as much, but here you are with thousands of stories from people who have been impacted. God gives us different gifts, and there are different ways. And I think we know that now in 2021, there are different ways to evangelize. We have technology, we have obviously printed word, and there's just so many different ways to do that. So, my last question for you, and I've been asking everybody this because I just think it's a unique and important question. What do you want your legacy to be when all is said and done and people look back at your 200 plus books, because I know there's more books coming? What do you want that legacy to be?
Well, strangely, I think I want part of my legacy to be not related to what I've done on the page. I want to be remembered as a good husband, a good father, and a good grandfather. I really work at that. That's something I invest my life in. I want that to be true. As far as professionally, um, my influence and visibility has gone far beyond anything I ever could have dreamed. And what I've learned is I can remember when Left Behind had sold the first three copies had total about 1 million copies. That's incredible. I mean, for any writer, a million copies of 3 books in a series is incredible. And Tyndale House, the publisher, sent me a framed copy of those covers and said, million copies. And I remember feeling pretty good about myself, like, wow, I really kind of pulled something off here. And within the next week or so, the publisher called me and they said, have you seen the sales figures for book 4 on Amazon? And I said, well, book 4 is not even released yet, right? It's not out. And they said, no, this is all pre-sales. So I went on Amazon to check. It was already #1 on Amazon. And the day it was released, I think it sold 1 million copies or something like that. And I remember that had the opposite effect on me that it might have. Instead of feeling proud of myself, I thought, all right, forgive me for that. I have nothing to do with this. I mean, I'm obeying. I'm not going to pretend I'm not. But this is clearly a God thing, and it humbled me, and then it started multiplying like that. So, but as I mentioned before, more important than those sales figures or the phenomenon of it is the changed lives. If I have a legacy of having had anything to do with somebody else making it to heaven, nothing competes with that.
Well, listen, I so appreciate your time today. Thanks for joining us, and thanks for all you do. Where can people go to find out more about you and all of these amazing books you've written?
JerryJenkins.com. And I teach writers online. I've got about 2,000 online writing students, and that's been a great fun thing, as you mentioned, to pay forward too. So if anybody's interested in learning to write, we've got everything from free blogs and tips all the way up to courses you can pay for. But JerryJenkins.com is where to check that out.
Thanks so much for your time. Really appreciate it.